The late afternoon sun cast a warm golden hue across Riverside Park, painting the world in soft amber tones. The peaceful sound of leaves rustling in the trees mingled with the distant laughter of children playing. The park was a small oasis of calm in the middle of a bustling city, a place where Marcus Davis often came to escape the chaos of his demanding job. Marcus sat alone on a weathered bench, his fingers lightly turning the pages of a book. His eyes scanned the text, but his mind occasionally wandered, pondering the weight of the world outside these park gates. The peaceful solitude allowed him to catch his breath, far removed from the pressures of his work. He had learned to take refuge in moments like this, away from the noise and judgment of a society that often looked at him as just another black man in the crowd. It wasn't something he let weigh him down, at least not here, not today. Today the world seemed still, almost perfect. Across the park, Officer Brian Harkins paced along his usual patrol route. He had worked this beat for over 2 decades, and in his mind, he knew every corner, every face. The city, with all its inhabitants, was a puzzle he had pieced together over time. But today, as he scanned the crowd, something felt off. His eyes paused on Marcus, sitting quietly on the bench, absorbed in his book. It wasn't the sight of Marcus himself, but the way he seemed to occupy the space. A black man alone, unbothered, calm in a park where, to Officer Harkins, he shouldn't be. The officer's gut instinct, a feeling he had come to trust over the years, told him something wasn't right. He had never seen Marcus here before, and though the feeling was faint, a part of him told him to investigate. That guy, Harkins muttered under his breath, narrowing his eyes. There was something about him. The suspicion lingered. Maybe it was the reports he had received earlier about a suspect matching Marcus's description. Tall, black, and alone. The perfect profile for trouble. As Harkins stood still, staring, he felt the familiar stirrings of suspicion growing inside him, like a storm brewing in his gut. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows on the pavement as Officer Brian Harkins took a few steps closer to Marcus. His boots echoed in the quiet park, the sound sharp and deliberate. There was no clear reason for his suspicion, no concrete evidence, just a gut feeling, a feeling he had learned to trust over the years of patrolling this area. As he approached Marcus, his eyes fixed on the man sitting alone on the bench, Marcus felt the weight of his gaze. He looked up from his book, his sharp eyes meeting Officer Harkins's. The moment their eyes locked, Marcus recognized the look all too well. Prejudice masked as concern, suspicion born not of any real threat, but of assumptions based solely on the color of his skin. It was a familiar feeling, one he had faced countless times before. But Marcus didn't flinch. His gaze remained steady, unwavering. There was a calmness about him, a quiet confidence that unsettled Officer Harkins. In that moment, Marcus knew exactly what was coming. He had been in situations like this before, and he knew how this could end. But today, he was determined not to let the officer escalate it further. Harkins stopped a few feet away from the bench, still watching Marcus. He tried to gauge the man in front of him, looking for any signs of guilt, of something that didn't match the usual suspects he dealt with. But there was nothing, just the steady gaze of a man who had learned to navigate a world that too often saw him as a threat, simply because of the color of his skin. Marcus closed his book slowly, marking his page with a finger, and placed it gently on the bench beside him. He kept his hands visible at all times, a small but deliberate gesture of peace. His posture remained calm, his body relaxed, even though his mind was racing. He knew that this moment, this interaction, could turn into something much more dangerous if he wasn't careful. "Afternoon," Officer Harkins said, his voice polite, but the edge of suspicion was still there, lurking beneath the surface. He tried to appear casual, but his body language betrayed him. He stood a little too stiffly, his hand hovering near his baton. It was subtle, but it was enough to make Marcus feel the tension in the air. "Afternoon," Marcus replied, his voice calm and even, betraying none of the discomfort he felt. He didn't look away, didn't shrink back. He was used to this, used to being judged based on nothing more than his appearance, his presence in the wrong place at the wrong time. "What brings you out here today?" Harkins asked, his eyes scanning Marcus's face, searching for a reason to justify his suspicion. It was a question that held more weight than it seemed. A question that sought to unearth something hidden, something to latch onto. "Just enjoying the park," Marcus said with a small, nonchalant smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. He had lived in the city long enough to know that just enjoying the park was often seen as an excuse. It was a neutral answer, one that didn't provide any ammunition for Harkins to latch onto. But Marcus could feel the officer's gaze intensifying, could feel the scrutiny on him like a weight pressing down. "You from around here?" Harkins asked, his tone shifting slightly, probing deeper. His eyes flicked to the book Marcus was reading, and Marcus could sense the officer's growing frustration. The officer was fishing for something, anything, to confirm his suspicion. "I've been around," Marcus answered, his lips curling into a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The vague response didn't sit well with the officer. Harkins shifted his weight, his posture becoming more confrontational. There was something about Marcus's calmness, his unbothered demeanor, that made him uneasy. "I'm going to need to see some ID," Harkins said, his voice firmer now, more insistent. The demand hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus felt a flicker of irritation rise within him, but he controlled it. He knew exactly what this was about. The officer was looking for a reason to exert power, to impose control. But Marcus wouldn't give him that satisfaction. "Am I under arrest?" Marcus asked, his voice cool and measured. The question was simple, but it carried weight. It was a challenge, one that Harkins didn't expect, but one that was necessary. Harkins hesitated, visibly thrown off by the question. He had expected Marcus to be nervous, to show some sign of submission. But Marcus's steady gaze, his calm voice, only made him more uncomfortable. "You will be if you don't cooperate," Harkins shot back, his hand moving closer to his holster, a subtle threat that Marcus didn't miss. The officer's growing frustration was evident now, but Marcus wasn't going to be intimidated. "I'm just sitting in a park," Marcus said, his voice steady. "Is there a law against that?" He was aware that any refusal to show ID could escalate things, but he also knew that he had rights. The tension between them thickened as Harkins stepped closer, looming over Marcus. The park, once a peaceful sanctuary, now felt like a battleground, the stakes rising with every moment. Marcus could feel the eyes of people nearby on them, but he refused to let the situation control him. His gaze remained fixed on the officer, and his body language was unyielding. The tension in the air grew thicker as Officer Harkins towered over Marcus. The park, which had once felt like an oasis of calm, was now the stage for a confrontation. The trees that had swayed peacefully in the breeze now seemed to whisper ominously, the distant laughter of children fading into the background, drowned out by the unspoken friction between the two men. Marcus could feel the officer's eyes on him, scrutinizing his every move. The subtle shift in Harkins's stance, his hand inching toward his holster, told Marcus everything he needed to know. The officer wasn't just concerned. He was preparing for something. But Marcus refused to flinch, his gaze steady and unyielding. He had faced situations like this before, when the assumption of guilt was painted on his skin, and nothing he did could shake it off. The officer's breath was shallow, his body coiled like a spring. Every moment of hesitation seemed to be intensifying the conflict, turning it into something far more dangerous. Marcus could feel his pulse quicken, but he kept his composure. There was no room for fear in this moment, just a quiet determination to not let the situation spiral out of control. "You really expect me to believe you're just sitting here, enjoying a book, huh?" Officer Harkins finally spoke, his voice laced with suspicion and an undercurrent of disdain. "A guy like you, alone in a park in broad daylight?" Marcus didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced down at his book, a small, almost imperceptible smirk curling at the corner of his lips. He was used to the judgment, used to being profiled as someone who didn't belong, but today, he wasn't going to let the officer dictate his actions. "A guy like me?" Marcus repeated calmly, looking up at Harkins again, his voice measured but firm. "What does that mean, officer?" His tone was neutral, but the weight of his question hung in the air, challenging the officer's assumptions. Harkins bristled at the question, visibly thrown by Marcus's unshaken demeanor. His hand tightened on his baton, and his face grew harder, more impatient. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for," he said quickly, though the excuse sounded thin even to him. "You're acting suspicious, so I'm asking for ID. Now show me." Marcus let out a slow breath, trying to remain calm. He had every right to refuse, but he also knew that refusal could escalate the situation. The law said he didn't have to show his ID unless there was a reason for his detention. But none of that mattered to Officer Harkins, who seemed to be blinded by his own prejudices. Marcus knew the consequences of backing down or showing fear. "You haven't told me what crime I'm being accused of," Marcus said, his voice unwavering. "Sitting in a park doesn't make me a criminal." His words were not only an assertion of his rights, but a quiet challenge to the officer's judgment. For a moment, Harkins hesitated, his brow furrowing as he tried to justify his actions. He wanted to maintain control, to not show weakness, but the unease gnawed at him. Marcus's calmness unsettled him. He wasn't reacting the way the officer expected. He was supposed to be nervous, guilty, maybe even begging for a way out. But instead, he was answering questions with cool precision, as though he were the one in control. "Don't get smart with me," Harkins snapped, his patience running out. His voice grew sharp and he took a step closer, crowding Marcus's space. "I said, show me your ID, now." Marcus felt the familiar knot in his stomach, the frustration of dealing with this kind of interaction yet again. It was as though his mere existence was a reason for suspicion. But he wasn't going to let it break him. He wasn't going to let Harkins decide who he was based on the color of his skin. "I'm not under arrest, am I?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but carrying the weight of a challenge. The question lingered in the air, and Harkins visibly flinched. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. His instinct was to assert dominance, to remind Marcus who was in charge. But the truth was, he had no reason to arrest him. No crime had been committed. Still, the officer's pride wouldn't let him back down. "You will be if you don't cooperate," Harkins growled, his hand now resting firmly on the holster of his weapon. The threat was clear. He was prepared to escalate the situation, and there was a small, twisted part of him that almost wanted Marcus to resist so he could justify his actions. Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't give Harkins the reaction he was looking for. Instead, he slowly reached into his pocket, his movements deliberate and careful. The officer's eyes never left him, watching each action with a predator's gaze. Marcus pulled out his wallet, the leather worn, but still intact, and handed over his ID. Harkins snatched the ID from his hand with a quick motion, his fingers trembling slightly as he scanned it. He didn't recognize the name at first, and the unease grew in his chest. The tension in the air thickened, like a storm ready to break. "I'm just doing my job," Harkins muttered under his breath, trying to justify his actions to himself. But the words felt hollow, even to him. He had no real reason for this arrest, but his pride and instincts were leading him down this path. His eyes flicked from the ID to Marcus's calm face, and something inside him stirred. A nagging feeling that he was making a mistake. But it was too late to back down now. "Stand up," Harkins ordered, his voice laced with authority as he moved to cuff Marcus. The officer's hands were shaking, but his resolve remained. He needed to prove that he was right, that his suspicion was valid, even if it meant pushing through his own doubts. Marcus took a slow breath, his body still but alert. He stood up as instructed, keeping his hands visible at all times. He didn't want to give Harkins any excuse to claim he felt threatened. His gaze never wavered as the officer reached for the cuffs. The cold metal snapped around his wrists, and Marcus felt a surge of frustration, but he pushed it down. He couldn't let himself get angry. He couldn't give the officer any reason to escalate things further. He knew what came next. Harkins would take him to the patrol car, and everything would fall into place soon enough. As the officer gripped his arm and led him toward the car, Marcus felt the weight of the world pressing down on him. He wasn't just fighting this one moment. He was fighting the years of racial injustice that led to this moment. He had no choice but to endure, to remain composed, because he knew the truth would come out eventually. But for now, he had to hold on to his calm, to his dignity. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into Marcus's wrists as Officer Harkins led him towards the patrol car. The sun had sunk lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the parking lot where the police car waited. The weight of the situation felt heavier now, each step echoing in Marcus's mind. His thoughts were a swirl of frustration, weariness, and an overwhelming sense of déjà vu. This wasn't the first time he had been wrongfully detained, and it wouldn't be the last. But there was a deeper fatigue beneath the surface, the exhaustion of knowing that despite all his accomplishments, he would always be seen as a suspect, as an other. As they reached the car, Harkins opened the back door, his hand still gripping Marcus's arm, and shoved him inside. Marcus slid into the back seat, the cold air inside the car biting at his skin, but he didn't flinch. His hands were still cuffed behind him, a small reminder of how quickly the world could turn hostile. He sat back against the seat, his eyes staring straight ahead, watching the trees blur as the car started to roll away from the park. Inside, Marcus's mind wasn't on the passing scenery. It was on the way the system had failed him once again. He had known this moment was coming when he first stepped into the park. He had known how this would play out, how an officer's suspicion would be enough to erase his rights, his dignity, and his identity. The world didn't see him as an FBI agent, as someone who had dedicated his life to justice. It only saw a black man sitting in a park, too calm for its liking. He sighed inwardly, fighting the wave of frustration that threatened to rise up. He was used to being the bigger person, to staying calm and composed, but that didn't mean the weight of this constant struggle didn't wear him down. How many more times would he have to prove his worth? How many more times would he have to fight against assumptions and prejudice before something changed? Officer Harkins drove in silence, his hands tight on the steering wheel, his knuckles white from the strain. Marcus could feel the officer's unease. He could see the way Harkins was gripping the wheel like it was the only thing keeping him together. The officer hadn't said much since they left the park, and Marcus wondered if it was because the doubt had begun to seep in. He had no real reason to arrest him. The description was weak at best, and there was no evidence linking Marcus to any crime. Harkins had acted on instinct, on a gut feeling that had no basis other than his own bias. Marcus glanced in the rearview mirror, catching Harkins's eyes for a brief moment. The officer quickly looked away, his discomfort palpable. It was clear now, Harkins had doubts. But it didn't matter. Once the cuffs were on, once the assumption of guilt had been made, the system would do its thing. It didn't matter who Marcus was. He was just another black man in a uniformed officer's eyes, guilty until proven innocent. Why don't you tell me what you were really doing in that park? Harkins's voice cut through the silence, a mix of suspicion and frustration lacing his words. His gaze flickered to the rearview mirror, trying to meet Marcus's eyes but failing. I told you, Marcus replied, his voice calm. I was reading, just enjoying the day. Harkins scoffed, his grip tightening on the wheel as if trying to hold on to his authority, to make sense of this chaos. You expect me to believe that? He asked, his voice edged with disbelief. A guy like you just sitting there reading a book? Marcus raised an eyebrow, his tone measured as he spoke. A guy like me? What does that mean? Harkins's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Marcus could see the officer's thoughts flickering. He was struggling, trying to justify the arrest. The officer didn't have a real explanation for his actions, and the weight of that was starting to settle in. He had acted on instinct, on bias, and now he had to live with it. The patrol car pulled into the precinct's parking lot, the low hum of the engine cutting through the silence. Marcus didn't speak as they drove up to the entrance, but his mind was already shifting, already planning what would happen next. He knew how this story would unfold. The confrontation wasn't over. There were still plenty of layers to uncover, plenty of questions to answer, but he had no fear of what was to come. It wasn't about him now. It was about the system, and he was about to make it face the truth. Harkins parked the car, but before Marcus could move, the officer opened the back door and pulled him out, dragging him towards the precinct. The weight of the situation didn't feel any lighter, but Marcus was resolute. He wasn't backing down. He wouldn't let Harkins or anyone else define him by their assumptions. As they entered the precinct, the usual buzz of activity filled the air, officers filing reports, phones ringing, conversations humming in the background. But the moment Marcus walked through the door, the energy in the room shifted. It was subtle, but it was there. Officers paused, some casting curious glances his way, others quickly looking away. Marcus was led to the booking area, where Officer Jenkins, a young man with short, neatly combed hair, looked up from his computer screen. He seemed surprised to see Harkins bringing someone in so quickly, especially given the lack of any solid explanation. "What's this about?" Jenkins asked, his voice laced with confusion. Harkins handed over Marcus's ID without a word. "Caught this guy in the park. Wasn't cooperating," he muttered, his tone clipped. Unwilling to admit the situation was spiraling out of control. Jenkins glanced at the ID, then at Marcus, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes. It was subtle, a brief hesitation that Marcus caught. The young officer quickly masked it, continuing with his duties. He handed the ID back to Harkins, his voice quiet. "Captain Bennett's in her office. You'll need to take him to her." The mention of Captain Bennett's name caused Harkins to stiffen slightly, but he nodded. Marcus didn't speak, but inside he felt a small sense of victory. It wasn't over. "Not yet. Let's go," Harkins muttered, his voice carrying a hint of defeat as he led Marcus down the hall to Captain Bennett's office. The walk down the precinct's hall felt like an eternity for Officer Harkins. Every step seemed to echo louder than the last, amplifying the heavy tension in the air. His heart raced with anxiety and pride, his old friends and colleagues all around him, yet he couldn't escape the feeling that something had gone horribly wrong. The uneasy weight in his chest was only growing heavier, and the quiet sense of guilt gnawed at him, even though he couldn't admit it to himself yet. His instincts, however familiar and trusted, had failed him today. As they reached Captain Bennett's office, Harkins hesitated. The door was slightly ajar, and the muffled voices of the officers inside echoed down the hall. Captain Bennett's reputation preceded her, fair but firm, someone who didn't tolerate mistakes. This was no ordinary arrest. The weight of his decision had already shifted the atmosphere of the precinct, and now the reality was crashing down on him. The consequences of his actions were about to come full circle. "Stay here," Harkins ordered Marcus sharply, though his voice faltered slightly. He opened the door and stepped inside, leaving Marcus standing alone in the hallway. He couldn't look the man in the eye again just yet. He wasn't ready for that confrontation. Inside the office, Captain Bennett sat behind her desk, a stack of papers in front of her, meticulously organized. Her sharp eyes lifted as Harkins entered, but she didn't speak immediately. Her silence carried weight, as though she were waiting for him to break it. The air between them was thick with expectation. "Harkin," Captain Bennett began, her voice steady and neutral. "What's this about?" Harkins shifted on his feet, feeling a bead of sweat form at the back of his neck. His mouth was dry. He cleared his throat and tried to maintain some semblance of authority, though the weight of the situation was crushing him. I caught him in the park." "Captain," he said, his voice faltering as he handed her Marcus's ID. He wasn't cooperating. Just sitting there, too calm, too out of place. Acting suspicious like he was hiding something. I thought he matched the description of a suspect we were looking for. Bennett took the ID, but her expression didn't change. She didn't immediately respond to the flimsy explanation. Instead, her eyes shifted to the window, where the faint light of the evening sun glinted off the nearby buildings. She exhaled deeply, her fingers tracing the edge of her desk. "You thought?" Bennett repeated, her voice colder now, more critical. "Officer Harkins, you've been on this beat for over 2 decades. You know better than to rely on assumptions. You know better than to arrest someone based on nothing more than a gut feeling, especially when you're dealing with a person of color." Harkins shifted uncomfortably. He felt the weight of her words like a punch to the gut, but he didn't answer. Instead, he looked down at the floor, unable to meet her gaze. He had made the decision to act on his instincts, but now it was clear he had made a mistake. "I followed protocol," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought it was the right call. I had to do something." He wasn't cooperating. Bennett's gaze was unwavering, her voice cutting through the air like a knife. "You didn't think. You acted on bias. And now you've arrested an FBI agent. The words hit Harkins like a thunderclap. His chest tightened, and his heart skipped a beat. FBI agent? The realization struck him hard. He had arrested someone with a level of authority that he couldn't even begin to comprehend. Someone who had the power to ruin his career in an instant. The panic set in, the cold sweat on his brow a sharp reminder of just how far he had gone. What? Harkins's voice was strained as he looked up, his face pale. His mind was reeling. This couldn't be happening. He couldn't have arrested an FBI agent. How had he missed that? Bennett's face remained unreadable as she stared at him. Marcus Davis is an FBI special agent, one of their top agents, she said, her tone steady but harsh. He's been working with us for years. He is well respected within the Bureau. Your mistake is bigger than you think, Harkins. This will have serious consequences, not just for you, but for the entire precinct. Harkins stood frozen, his thoughts racing as the weight of his actions fully hit him. The guilt, the shame, it all surged forward in a wave that he couldn't control. He had acted on his prejudices, and now he had to pay the price. The man he had assumed was a criminal was someone who had the power to expose everything he had done. Captain Bennett's expression softened, but only slightly. I'm placing you on temporary leave for now, pending an official review. You'll be under investigation for your actions today. I've already spoken to the higher-ups and they're not happy. This could lead to disciplinary action or even termination. Her words felt like the final blow, and Harkins staggered back as though the room had spun around him. He had been a cop for over 2 decades. His badge, his career, everything he had worked for, was now in jeopardy because of a single, impulsive decision. Captain, I didn't know, Harkins whispered, his voice filled with regret. I didn't know who he was. I was just doing my job. You weren't doing your job, Harkins, Bennett said coldly. You were letting your biases dictate your actions. That's not what this department stands for, and you need to understand that. A long silence followed, heavy with the realization that the officer who had long prided himself on following protocol and keeping the peace had allowed his personal prejudices to shape his actions. The idea of a man like Marcus, calm, composed, powerful, being reduced to an object of suspicion because of his skin color had shattered everything Harkins had believed about himself. As the silence stretched on, Bennett turned towards the door. I'll have you escorted off the premises. For now, you're suspended while we review this matter. I suggest you take this time to reflect on your actions. Harkins remained rooted to the spot, unable to find the words. His whole world felt like it was collapsing in on him. The shame was overwhelming, and for the first time in years, he wondered whether he had ever really understood what it meant to serve and protect. The weight of what had just unfolded seemed to follow Officer Harkins every step as he left Captain Bennett's office. The precinct around him felt foreign, every face now a reminder of his mistake. His mind raced, replaying the events that had led him here, the sinking feeling in his stomach growing heavier with each passing second. The worst part was that it wasn't just about one bad decision. It was about what that decision revealed about him, about his own biases, about the fact that he had, for a fleeting moment, allowed his prejudice to overshadow everything he was supposed to stand for. The door to Captain Bennett's office clicked shut behind him as he walked down the hallway, his eyes focused on the floor. He was acutely aware of the whispers in the air, of the officers who cast furtive glances his way as he passed. It wasn't lost on him that the once strong bond of trust between him and his colleagues was now irrevocably broken. As he reached the exit, Officer Jenkins appeared, his expression a mix of concern and wariness. Harkins, Jenkins said softly, his voice cautious. What's going on? Captain said you're on leave. What happened? Harkins didn't answer right away. He just shook his head, the bitter realization still fresh in his mind. The name Marcus Davis echoed in his thoughts, reminding him of the depths of his failure. He had arrested an FBI agent, someone who was not just a law-abiding citizen but a person of great importance. Someone he should have respected, not profiled. I messed up, Harkins said finally, his voice hoarse. His eyes met Jenkins's briefly, and he saw the disbelief there. The disappointment. Jenkins, like most of the officers in the precinct, had always respected him. He had built a reputation as a reliable, by-the-book cop. And now all of that was crumbling. Harkins started, but he couldn't find the words. I arrested the wrong man. I let my assumptions guide me. I thought he was a criminal, but he wasn't. He's an FBI agent. I've ruined everything. Jenkins stood silent for a moment, then shook his head slowly, his brow furrowing. You didn't know, Harkins. But you know you can't just arrest people because of how they look. Not in this job. Not in this world. You've got to do better than that. The truth stung, but Harkins couldn't deny it. He had known better. He had prided himself on being fair, yet here he was, caught up in a moment of prejudice that he couldn't undo. I know, Harkins whispered. I know, Jenkins sighed. It's not just about the mistake, Harkins. It's about how you move forward. You have to own this. Really own it, Harkins nodded, his throat tightening. I'll try. I'll do better. But right now I don't know if I can face anyone here. Jenkins hesitated, then placed a hand on Harkins's shoulder. You're not alone, Harkins. We've all made mistakes. This one's big, but it doesn't mean the end of everything. You need to make it right, for yourself and for everyone you've worked with. The words hung in the air between them, but Harkins couldn't find any comfort in them. Instead, they seemed to underscore the enormity of the journey ahead, the path he would need to take to reckon with his own demons. As Harkins stepped out of the precinct, the city streets felt colder than usual. The sounds of the world around him, the honking cars, the distant chatter, seemed muffled as he walked to his car. He could barely focus on the road ahead, his mind still reeling from the enormity of what he had done. He couldn't shake the image of Marcus Davis's unflinching calm, the way Marcus had looked at him, both challenging and forgiving all at once. Harkins had tried to assert his authority, to impose control, but Marcus had stripped it all away with nothing more than his steady gaze. The thought of Marcus sitting in that park, reading, as the weight of unjust suspicion bore down on him, made Harkins's stomach turn. Marcus hadn't let fear control him, but Harkins, he had let his biases cloud his judgment, and now there was no easy way out. The consequences were coming, and he wasn't sure he was ready to face them. Later that afternoon, as Harkins sat in his car, parked outside his home, he thought about the conversation with Captain Bennett. She had been firm, unwavering in her stance, and despite the turmoil inside him, he knew she was right. His actions had consequences. He couldn't hide from that. But what hurt the most was knowing that he hadn't just hurt Marcus Davis. He had hurt the trust that the community had placed in him, the very essence of his job. And that was something far harder to repair. He sat for a while, trying to think of what to do next. There were no easy answers, no quick fixes. But if he wanted any chance of redemption, of rebuilding the trust he had broken, he would need to face Marcus again. He would need to make things right. As the evening settled into dusk, and the world outside his window grew darker, Harkins made a decision. Tomorrow he would go back to the precinct. He would speak to Marcus. He would apologize. And he would start making amends, not just with Marcus, but with himself. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Captain Bennett's office, casting thin slivers of light onto the floor. The precinct was quieter today, the usual hum of activity tempered by the weight of the previous day's events. The air seemed charged, like the calm before a storm, but everyone was on edge. Word had spread about Officer Harkins's suspension and the arrest of Marcus Davis, the FBI agent. There were whispers, and some officers couldn't help but wonder how something so serious could happen in their own precinct. Marcus Davis, however, was sitting in Bennett's office. His calm demeanor hadn't wavered, though his mind was elsewhere. He was used to walking into rooms filled with tension, used to being scrutinized for no reason other than the color of his skin. But today, his thoughts were not on the judgment he faced. Today, he was thinking about the bigger picture. The conversation with Bennett the previous evening had been a step in the right direction. Marcus appreciated her willingness to confront the truth. Captain Bennett had shown a level of integrity that he hadn't expected from someone in her position. It had given him hope that the system, at least within this precinct, was capable of self-reflection and change. Today, however, wasn't about hope. It was about the reality of what had happened and what needed to come next. Marcus had seen enough of these moments in his career to understand that systemic change didn't come from a single act of accountability. It was a long, painful process that required confronting uncomfortable truths and addressing the deeper issues that lay beneath. "Mr. Davis, thank you for coming," Bennett said as she entered the room. Her expression was firm, but there was a softness to her eyes today. She closed the door behind her, taking a seat across from Marcus. There was no pretense between them now. The formalities had been stripped away. "Of course, Captain," Marcus replied, offering her a nod. His eyes were steady, his posture relaxed despite the weight of the conversation ahead. He had dealt with worse, and yet the situation here was different. This wasn't about him being wrongfully detained. It was about ensuring that what happened to him didn't happen to someone else. "Let's get to it," Bennett began. "We've made the decision regarding Officer Harkins. As you know, the department is reviewing the incident, but I've already made it clear to him that his actions are unacceptable. We are implementing disciplinary measures, and I've recommended his termination. We'll proceed with a full investigation, but I want you to know that the review is already in motion." Marcus nodded, though his expression remained neutral. He had expected this decision. He had hoped for it. But there was no satisfaction in it, no sense of victory. Harkins's actions had already caused harm that couldn't be undone, and the damage to the relationship between the department and the community was deep. "I appreciate your swift action, Captain," Marcus said. "But we both know that this goes beyond one officer. Harkins may be the face of the problem right now, but he's not the only one. You're dealing with a culture here, a culture that allows this kind of behavior to go unchecked." Bennett leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady. "I agree, and I know that one person doesn't represent the entirety of the department. We have a responsibility to address that culture. We've already begun revising our training programs to include more comprehensive education on racial bias, de-escalation techniques, and accountability." Marcus raised an eyebrow, but his expression softened slightly. "That's a start," he said. "But what about the mindset? What about the officers who've been here for years, who've developed these biases over time? Training can only go so far. Change has to come from within." Bennett sighed and nodded, understanding the weight of Marcus's words. "You're right," she said. "It's going to be a long process. We're working on implementing more oversight, including independent reviews and ensuring officers are held accountable, not just in their actions, but in their attitudes." "This is just the beginning, Marcus. I can't promise it will happen overnight, but I can promise you that we're committed to change." There was a long pause as Marcus considered her words. He had heard promises before, too many of them, in fact, but he had learned to be cautious, to not let words cloud his judgment. The only thing that mattered was action, and that would take time, effort, and consistency. It would take more than just one captain, more than just one department, to make a real difference. "I know it's not going to be easy," Marcus said finally, "but it's a start. I'll help in any way I can. The system can't keep going on like this because it's broken. Too many people have suffered because of it." Bennett's expression was firm, but there was a sense of respect in her eyes. "I'll hold you to that," she said quietly, her tone resolute. "We'll do this together, one step at a time." As Marcus stood to leave, he felt a subtle shift in the room. It wasn't a dramatic change, but it was enough to give him hope. The road ahead would be long, and the fight would not be easy. But Marcus knew that he had already made a difference, by simply standing up, by being the man he was, by not backing down. As he walked out of Captain Bennett's office and into the hallway, he passed a few officers. Some avoided his gaze, others nodded respectfully, but he didn't expect anything from them. They were still caught in the system, just as he had once been. But he had faith in the process, faith that this moment, this shift, would lead to something better. Marcus left the precinct with a quiet sense of resolve. This wasn't just about holding one officer accountable. It was about changing an entire system, and no matter how long it took, he was ready to continue the fight. He wasn't doing it for himself anymore. He was doing it for everyone who would come after him. Everyone who had ever been wronged by the system.